So in this third segment of Module 4, we will talk about the second paradox in gender and health. That, of course, referring to the relative social disadvantage women experience relative to men without the corresponding health disadvantage, at least in terms of mortality and life expectancy. So here again, this paradox is referring to a condition that corresponds more closely to the other kinds of paradoxes we've been talking about or mentioned, Hispanics versus whites, immigrants versus native-born, and blacks and whites with respect to affective disorders, where the expected or observed social inequality does not correspond into a health inequality of the same nature. Said another way, unlike with other major axes of social stratification, male privilege does not translate into unambiguous health benefits for men. So again, another way of stating this paradox is that women's social disadvantage does not translate into corresponding health disadvantage. And having established that, at least in industrialized countries like the US, women enjoy a relative parity or advantage with respect to health compared to men, and with respect to health outcomes that apply to both men and women. We're not talking about contexts where really extreme abject disadvantage and discrimination disfavor women. The question then next regarding this paradox is, to what extent are women really, how and to what degree more socially disadvantaged relative to men? And there are, of course, several different ways of characterizing gender inequality. This score from the Global Gender Gap shows the relative ranking of the U.S. compared to other countries. And it looks at several different characteristics where gender equality is relevant: economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, political empowerment, and health and survival. On education and health, women do really well in the U.S. The U.S. is ranked very high relative to other countries. But in terms of economic participation, which refers to things like wage equality, participation in the labor force, occupation of high-level positions, and parity across industries and professions, the U.S. ranks very, very low, as it does with in the case of political empowerment. They're again looking at gender parity in occupation of public office, the seniority and level of political participation, and so forth. So you can see it's a really mixed picture on these metrics of gender equality. Here, the overall rank across these four indices for the U.S. is 22 in 2006. When I looked at the rankings for 2012, the U.S. was still at 22, although in the intervening years, its ranking had fluctuated slightly, then was back at 22. So it's fairly constant for the last several years. We often characterize gender inequality in terms of gaps in wages. And here you're looking at aggregate dollars in median earnings for full-time workers in the U.S. Census across race. So overall, you see across education levels wage differentials between men and women, and then you see the persistence of those wage differentials across education levels, across racial and ethnic groups, that vary in the amount but are consistent in the direction of the gap. Although the wage gap in earnings, the gap in earnings by gender has changed dramatically over time, of course. So here you have median weekly earnings of women and men in absolute dollars here on the left axis. In the right axis, you have the percentage gap between the two. So you can see this black line traces that over time, a dramatic decrease. This metric from the Bureau of Labor Statistics does not account for differentials in labor force characteristics. So different occupations, different educational attainment, and background characteristics. And so once you account for those characteristics that are importantly related to income, you find that this gap is considerably smaller, although still quite persistent. Another way of characterizing the gender gap in earnings here, looking across education with a little bit more granularity by sex, and looking just in the second quarter of 2010. And what you see is persistently at every level of education, men's weekly earnings exceeding those of women's, with the gaps sort of widening here at the levels of higher educational attainment. Here you're looking at gender gaps across professions, and again, this correspondence with the highest gap in management and professional fields, where the participants have higher educational attainment as well. These metrics, of course, don't always account for the kinds of occupational segregation that often leads to wage differentials by gender that you're seeing here. So one important alternative way of characterizing the pay gap is to look at it with great proximity to graduation, before a lot of the divergent trajectories in the labor force kick in, those having to do with occupational segregation and also having to do with time out of the labor force for childbearing and rearing, which disproportionately affects women relative to men. So when you look and you just restrict your optic to the 1 year after graduation from college, you're seeing the gap that exists before those other factors start to take effect. Here you're looking at an 82% differential, women 1 year out of college earning 82% of what men earn. This narrows, the gap narrows once you do control for things that are found to affect earnings even at that point in time, like what major you graduated in and therefore what kind of occupation you're likely to go into. Here you see again 1 year after college differentials across fields. So in some, there's really no significant gender difference in earnings, the blue bars, but in every other one where there are differentials, they favor men relative to women in varying degrees. More about that pay gap that's current and reflects some of these different ways of characterizing it is found in this report. However, so we see evidence that gender inequality is persistent in countries like the US, but no doubt the picture of gender inequality is evolving. One optic on gender inequality in the US that's received a lot of attention is changes in graduation from college by gender, which have been very dramatic. You see from 1950 on up into 1990 a tremendous narrowing of the gap, and then this really dramatic crossover after that point, at which point women's college graduation exceeds those of men. Here you see employment by gender over the same time period roughly, and again a very dramatic narrowing of the gender gap. And this progress, of course, in labor force participation and parity in education leads us to Mitt Romney's brilliant and insightful comment about his access to binders full of women when he was trying to fill cabinet posts as described in the second presidential debate when he was up against Barack Obama, and asked about how he would respond to evidence of gender inequality in the workforce. But again, another caveat, so we've seen persistent gender inequality, social inequality, we've seen progress, but also progress with an interesting and important caveat, which is that U.S. women are faring much worse than high-income country counterparts in terms of longevity, and American women's health status is deteriorating relative to other countries at a faster rate than men's. As described here in this IOM report, recent IOM report, looking at the health of the population in the U.S. relative to other countries, something that's received a lot of attention and hand-wringing, and is part of what is reflected in the Montez article that you read. So if we accept that there's sufficient empirical evidence for the existence of something we could characterize as a paradox, the next question becomes, why is there this paradox? And one immediate question that arises is whether there is not an innate biological advantage that women experience relative to men that may be related to chromosomal differences that are protective over the life course, extracirculating estrogens prior to menopause that are protective, and other hormonal and constituent sort of constitutional differences in men and women that are biologically protective. And there is some evidence to suggest that this might be operative for certain health outcomes, again, for certain ages or periods of the life course, but it's not believed to be enough to explain the whole differential, especially given the fact that we see that the gap in men and women's health is something that is not fixed over time. So it can't simply be a function of innate biological differences, which leads us to ask for other interpretations. And what I would like to do for the rest of this discussion is talk about using our dominant etiologic models of material pathways, material resource differences, or more kinds of psychosocial stressors, and look at how the relationship between gender and health might be explained, and more specifically how this paradox might be explained with reference to those models and those putative mechanisms. So if we start with the more material resource pathway, one reason why the gender health relationship might not play out as we would anticipate is just by virtue of cohabitation and common interests, that unlike other axes of social stratification, race and in class, there really is a greater degree of integration across genders and with important implications for the sharing of material resources and how material pathways might be relevant for health. Here, Henry Kissinger said it nicely: nobody will ever win the battle of the sexes. There's too much fraternizing with the enemy. On the material pathway, we'll come back to that also with reference to fundamental causes later in this lecture. When we think about the psychosocial stuff that has to do with processes by which social inequality is interpreted, made sense of, responded to through some cognitively mediated pathway, rather than a stress pathway that's a function of disproportionate burden. So, for example, we might assume that the disproportionate burdens faced by women, whereby they are working both in the formal labor force and in the domestic sphere and carrying that sort of double shift workload, that the stresses that go along with that might be relevant for health. I think what we're talking about here, though, setting that aside, is what are the psychosocial processes that go with exposure to sexism, as we talked about, and what, if anything, is analogous to the psychosocial stressors that go with exposure to racism. And here again, I want to invoke this concept of hegemony, and with reference to how we get exposed to and internalize natural attitudes, so-called about gender, whereby in large part because we have this underlying biological difference kind of framework to work with, and we have different roles that are often very much related to biological differences, reproduction, and it's sort of easy to see, and it's often invoked as a way for natural attitudes to play out by virtue of natural role differentials between men and women. And therefore, everything that follows from that is kind of part of the right and proper, normal, natural state of things that shouldn't really be questioned, and so forth. And I want to explore this a little bit more because we have some good theory and empirical evidence about the ways in which the gender order gets reproduced, internalized, normalized, and accepted, even by those for whom it is not very advantageous. And I want to argue that this process here, which might be relatively more unique for gender and sexism, has important implications for potentially blunting the psychosocial costs associated with sexism in society.